I've mentioned a few different ethical systems in this series on morality, but I think it's time to put this into practice using some applied ethics. Instead of just discussing the idealistic ways someone can be moral, I will talk about how this is possible realistically. But before I proceed with the titular example, it would be best to explain all of the relevant stances on morality, as well as my views on them. I've already asserted that morality is subjective, and by moral subjectivism, I mean that certain moral statements or propositions can not just be true or false. It depends. This is complementary with moral relativism, which it's divided into a few subcategories, two of which I agree with and will explain. There's descriptive moral relativism, which says that it is true that people will always disagree on what it means to be moral, which is admittedly hard to argue with, unlike the morality that people are always disagreeing about. And then there is metaethical moral relativism, which states that this is because morality is not a universal truth, but rather utterly relative to the cultural practices of the people. Now, this is the more controversial point, but I still hold it to be true because, like I said in the last video, there are instances such as religious sacrifice, ending the misery of an individual who would only experience exponential suffering for the rest of their life, or just self-defense that make an act like murder at least less bad to the individual committing it, or the society that the individual lives in. So, one example of a metaethical relativistic system is situational ethics. Now, that is how it sounds. This is the view that one must be guided by some personal ideal to know how to act in a specific scrupulous situation, which does sound eerily similar to what I was talking about, my point from last time, and it being guided by an ideal. So, situational ethics is a form of consequentialism, which is also a branch of relativism. And consequentialism is just the realization of the ends justifying the means. The general good is more important than how one gets there. So, these philosophies naturally contrast with theories of moral absolutism, like that of deontology. Now, this is the other system I've mentioned before. The categorical imperative was created by Immanuel Kant and is the most significant representative of deontological ethics. It can be stated simply as a rule that every action one takes should be according to a maxim which you can will to be a universal law. Essentially, treat others how you want to be treated, or how you think everyone should be treated, and except if that's as a means, one should only be treated as an end. The problem, however, is that acting under a set of immutable rules leads to questionable circumstances, such as, being compelled to tell the truth to some assassin who plans to kill your friend and just ask you where that friend is so they can kill them, because you cannot will the act of lying to be universalizable. You have to tell the assassin where your friend is, because, who would want to live in a world where everyone lies, which is not advantageous to you or your friend. So, since there are still some pretty helpful ideas in absolutist as well as relativistic philosophy, there was kind of an attempt to reconcile the unrealistic strictness of deontology with the maybe ambiguous nature of situationalism with rural utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism popularized by John Stuart Mill, intent on minimizing suffering and maximizing pleasure. So the rural part implies that instead of doing whatever brings about the greatest end, you must follow a set of rules concerning whatever brings about the best end, unless there is a stringent exception to keep the overall well-being of everyone. I do like this a lot better than just act utilitarianism or consequentialism in general. Yet, it is true, in my opinion, that while we can never be good, obviously, we can still have a good will and should act out of duty for the sake of this good, as Kant puts it. And so this focus on intentions rather than just the end is more leaning toward Kant. So I'm not completely saying that I lie within one specific system that I've been talking about. Except to find my explanation of virtue ethics, see my first video in this series, but I still think that this system is one of the best because all of the moral views that I've been talking about can be incorporated into it in some way, while still making it a consistent task to determine whether the action you're currently doing is ultimately better than it is worse. It's really about making a habit of following this ideal or rule so that you can have a better idea of what to do or what exceptions to make in the morally ambiguous situations. And now that I've got all of these definitions out of the way, honestly, I did not think that it would take this long. But we can begin to answer the question. So we must first ask why we would want to hurt an organism within the order of Diptera in the first place. So this is primarily because the buzzing and attempts to infiltrate one's ear canal are a constant displeasure, and it is impossible to reason with the insect so as to negotiate terms for the interaction to be ended peacefully, right? Our next question is, would the fly even feel displeasure or pain if it were to be swatted away? The latest article I could find on this subject, which I can link in the description, it claimed that the insects would respond to negative stimuli in some recorded cases, indicating that nociception or pain is still a possibility and should be considered. However, given how little certainty there is for whether or not a fly could be harmed, science yet again lacks the proficiency to deal with such a problem that philosophy does not. So it is clear that flies are not thinking beings like we are. I do believe that life itself is one of the most valuable things in the known universe, but more so, it is the sentient and cognizant personalities of humankind that are valuable to an even greater degree than a being who cannot even comprehend how they could act justly toward the rest of the world. Obviously, I am biased. We all are. See my first philosophy video, but flies don't even have the capacity to possess biases, you know? Moving on to our next question, I could ask, do the lives which flies live solely through their instincts bring more benefit than they do harm to the world they interact with? Or would the murder of a fly bring about a greater end than if it continued to live? Well, the pros of the dipteran are its significant contribution to pollination and the reproduction of plants, which are beneficial to us for countless reasons, as well as the fly's natural benefit to other beings after death, where their rich quantity of nutrients and protein can bring health to us, and more often the predatory spiders. But the cons, however, are a lot weightier. It is estimated that around half of all humans who have ever lived died from the mosquito-borne illness of malaria. Mosquitoes are a family of flies, and when you look at how there is roughly 17 quadrillion flies present, not just like overall over history, but at one single moment, right now there are just 17 quadrillion, which is just incomprehensibly larger than any statistic you could bring up about how many of those have been killed by humans. They have done so much more to us as a whole than we have to them. We are looking at ridding the universe of a single insect who has no friends or family that would mourn its loss, and no impactfulness large enough to change anything by more than an infinitesimal percentage. Hurting a fly would have practically no effect on your moral state, at least from a consequentialist perspective, or more specifically, from negative consequentialism, where it's more important that what one does is less bad than more good. To find any further sense of ethics within this problem, we must return to deontology. What is your intent for hurting this fly? Is it a will that could be applied as a general standard for what is good? Not exactly. If everyone actively possessed this will, then the fly population would rapidly decrease. Despite their astronomical number, humans are still very powerful, and to live without flies is to live without most chocolate, because they are pretty much the only pollinators of cacao trees, that the extinction of which would cause infinitely more suffering to our world. This is my defense of rule utilitarianism. Make it a general rule that you should never harm another living being, because they're the most valuable thing, and living's nice, you wouldn't want to take that away, unless the case is such that a fly's buzzing causes you more displeasure than the fly could ever possibly know. So this is also my defense of meatarianism. When I delight in the taste of a cheeseburger, the animal has already been killed. There's nothing that can be done to further benefit that individual's life except allow it to give you its nutrients and the very delectable savoriness that it has. Sure, doing so would only support and reinforce the practices of the industries that are mistreating the animals in the first place, depending on where you're even getting the meat from initially. But even so, it's only by an infinitesimal percentage. Furthermore, why is it okay to not eat animals, but it is to eat plants? Evidence for a plant's reaction to negative stimuli is a bit ambiguous as well. Buying from plant companies could still be supporting unethical business practices, like those that mistreat animals, just as buying from meat companies could actually do good to help support struggling farmers. In his book, Starry Messenger, Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization, Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about this subject in one of his chapters. He brings up the fact that the sources of energy that are needed for us to survive, like protein, carbohydrates, and fat, which are found in meat, exist in two foods that do not require the act of murder: milk and honey. The very same foods that are utterly forbidden in the vegan diet. How do you like that, PETA? I support the ethics of Temple Grandin's work. Eating other animals is really beneficial to the ecosystem and something necessary for the survival of our species. We just need to make sure that how we go about this process remains as humane and moral as possible. The rule of not harming living beings also means that we should work to improve our own species' health in moderation to the others. While indeed goodness is never possible, it is still the one thing that every single person wants in some way or another. And it can become more achievable if we actually try to direct our will toward it. It is okay to hurt a fly if your intention is in the hope of attaining a healthier, easier, and better life for yourself. And if it's not at the cost of the physical and mental well-being of someone else. After all, somebody could have a really deep attachment to the fly, and you choose not to swat it away so that you're not just passing your mental anguish onto the fly lover. Please leave a comment if you have a response to any of my assertions. In the meantime, I will be advocating for the ethical treatment of animals by allowing them to ethically treat my taste buds.